Well, hello everyone. I'm excited to bring to you another OnTap series. So this is our part 2 of Google Analytics or GA4 or migrating to GA4 or all the fun things we get to tell you about and the do's and don'ts of GA4. So I'm happy to introduce Jason Hackenberry, who is our CSM and head of partnerships now here at Arctic Leaf, and now is also doing a lot more data analysis. So Jason is the individual from Arctic Leaf who'll be talking and speaking about GA4. And then Glenn is someone that I have known a long time. I looked up to him as a mentor, as a business coach, as someone who has been around the block. So it's really awesome to be able to kind of share the stage with Glenn and Jason and talk a little bit more about GA4. So I'll get right into it. So what are we going to cover today, right? So that's an important question. First things first is timeline, right? When is GA4 going to actually, get launched? Google keeps changing things, dates keep changing. So we'll try to give some clarity around that. Popping open the hood, kind of the terms and navigation. So just how to the lay of the land of GA4, events, right? How do events work? Totally different than GA3 or Universal Analytics. So it's all about events. Obviously, Arctic Leaf is in the e-commerce ecosystem and Glenn is much more in the B2B or lead generation side. So I think it's going to be an interesting understanding of how do you use GA4 in the e-commerce landscape, and then how would you use that in the lead gen landscape. And then we'll get into some conversations around reporting across GA4 and Universal Analytics. And then last but not least, what are the known bugs, right, that we know about and issues that we're still going to see or still seeing, right? So obviously, Google's been very integrated into our daily lives, and especially if you're in business, almost everyone talks and has Google Analytics installed on their websites. So pretty cool opportunity to be able to kind of be on the forefront and give some guidance and some thought leadership around GA4. But I will pass over our first slide that we're going to talk over timeline, and I'm going to ask Glenn to kind of just give us a high-level overview of kind of some important dates that people should be aware of, just because it is very quickly approaching this shut off. So Glenn, you want to talk a little bit about the timeline?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Josh. So I'm going to make this a very simple left to right. And let's all look at the left-hand side here. We'll start over there, call it the number 1 event on this timeline. So that was in late 2020. And if you weren't noticing that they had taken this little obscure product called App Plus Web and changed it into this magical 4th version of Google Analytics, they did. But you can be excused for that because if my memory serves, late 2020, we were kind of sidelined by other global issues. Anyway, we have had some time that Google has given us to use that GA4 in parallel with the previous version, which you might think of as version 3, but is commonly known as Universal Analytics. And Universal Analytics is continuing, but we're going to hit this road bump at the end of this month, June 30th, 2023, because after that, or on July the 1st, Universal Analytics will no longer be collecting data on websites. If you have recently gone into your Google Analytics, you will see a countdown clock that shows that this is what Google is doing. It does not seem that they will be extending this deadline. There's no indication being given of that. So this is a very real time. Now let's take a second and ask, so does that mean that Universal is completely gone? No, let's hop over for a second because most of us are on free versions of analytics. So skip the middle one, that 3rd one. Let's go to the 4th one, which says July 1st, 2024. That is the date that the data that is sitting inside of Universal Analytics So it'll be all historical. By that time, it'll be at least a year old. But that information, as of July 1st of 2024, will be going away. And so you have up to a year that they're giving you to download historical information. You won't see any new information, but you'll at least be able to get it inside your systems, inside of your company. And then finally, let's revisit kind of the middle one. So that's only for people who have been on a paid version of analytics, which is known as 360. They get a little longer than the rest of us. So they get until January 1st. And then finally, we have the turn off date for those guys, which is a year after that in 2025. Now, one last thing, and this is the point where we had under the fourth one, where it was update. If you had thought that they were only going to give you 6 months of that information, you would have been right. But Google decided to extend it, and we're trying to bring you a very clear way of explaining what they've done, because their wording is horribly confusing. Simply put,
Google's listening, so
I hope they are.
They are.
That they extended how long you have access to that static historical data by another 6 months. So you're not getting any more universal analytics collecting, but you got longer to go and get it before it's gone. And that's the summary of the time.
That was a change that even I just learned about, because I was under the impression that it was 6 months. So thank you, Google, for giving us a year to download data. So that's really good. We're gonna also post this timeline on our blog there afterwards. So and we'll try to keep that updated as time goes on. So if Google does decide to make any changes, we'll definitely update. So Glenn, any additional updates to timeline, or are we good to move to the next slide?
I think we're good to move on to taking people under the hood.
All right, awesome. So what does that mean, popping under the hood, right? So GA is obviously a little bit different. So I'm going to ask Jason to talk about this, and it's something we're actually going to build a little bit of a glossary, but basically things are a little bit different. They're named different. So Jason, you want to kind of just tell us a little bit about some of the modifications or changes that Google has made around understanding metrics and goals and conversions and all of that stuff?
Sure. I do call those minor headaches, but yeah, I'll kind of dive. So if I would hope most of you by now that are listening to this have already gone on to GA4, poked around, and if you have, you probably noticed that there's a lot of different verbiage now. So these are just kind of the basic standard ones. As an example, goals are now conversions. Now, I'll be the first to admit, myself and a lot of the merchants I speak to, we didn't really use goals a lot in Universal Analytics, or at least we didn't use it the way we could have. It wasn't the best method, but now that idea is called conversions in GA4. So essentially what you're doing is you're attributing a conversion to an event you create, right? We look at page views are now called views, sessions are now session start. But I think the most obvious one for most of us in e-commerce, at least, is bounce rate is now called engagement rate. Now, the way I like to look at this is that this is the inverse of what bounce rate was, where bounce rate measured users leaving your page, engagement rate measures users staying on your page for at least 10 seconds. Now, of course, you can change what date or time parameter you wish, but that 10 seconds is an important note because, like we said in the last webinar, GA4 can measure time. So that's kind of the idea around that notion there. And again, average session duration is now average engagement time. Again, that time thing with GA4 is a big indicator. And then finally, there's been an audience refresh. And I think this is, Glenn could probably talk to that a little bit, but essentially, audience refresh is really good for anyone out there using Google Ads. This is going to give you a little bit more meat to attack with your Google Ads. So.
I think, first of all, I love what you did with I kind of like the engagement rate metric versus bounce rate, because I like that it's inverted. I also think it's more of like a positive rather than a negative, right? It's like, oh, look how many people just left my site or how quickly they bounced, right? Versus, hey, here's a customer base that's engaging with my brand. And ultimately you want to see that metric go up rather than go down. So I think that's an interesting approach that Google took on that one.
I agree completely. And I was going to say that I think having that positive connotation is important. And Josh, you know this from internally. I don't like to say pain points. I like to call pain points focus points, right?
Yeah.
Because they're an area to focus on. So it is an important kind of notion. So good on Google in that one.
Yeah, it's just the power of the words that we use, right? Like it really does kind of make a difference versus like I'm going to try or I'm going to do, right? It's kind of that same kind of philosophy. Something I did miss in the introduction, this is our OnTap series, right? So OnTap is our version of our webinar. So if you're watching, you should have a beverage of some kind. It could be water, alcohol, if it, tickles your fancy. It's 5 o'clock somewhere. I'm drinking actually a pretty cool nootropic product that I just tried. So it's kind of like help mental cognitive stuff, but definitely go get your beverage. Super important to have that. Let's keep rolling. So Glenn, I think you were going to talk a little bit about the audience refresh.
Yeah, I will. And this is a perfect chance for us to roll into the next slide because it'll set the stage for what this audience refresh means. So the thing with Google Analytics 4 that does set it apart, which should give merchants, website owners of all kinds, a chance to look at this again with fresh eyes, is that they've boiled it down to almost a childlike, simple way of tracking. And that is that they just make everything an event. So you can have, for let's say a given user, maybe the different systems that they're pointed at, and they're expressed maybe by one would be your main domain, and then you could have maybe a small plugged in domain that is acting for cart functionality or forms, whatever it may be. All these tie together, and then Google Analytics is, as has been said already, just kind of timestamping and showing that things are happening, and it just throws everything in, including the kitchen sink. So a quick example would be if you look at the events that are coming out of this user, the very first one is a session start event. Then it's got this thing called a parameter. All we need to remember is that GA4 is saying I have some kind of event, so it gives that event a name. In this case, I have a start of a session. The parameter would be something really simple like when it happened, or it might be on what device it happened. So, or they might assign an individual user ID. There's the user for that session. The point of these events is you can have all kinds of them, and that GA4 gives us new means of tying together all the people who share a particular kind of event and call them an audience. So if I think all the people who put something into a cart, I could immediately consider them all an audience. GA4 knows exactly what that means. And of course, GA4 is going to give preference to the ad platform that's tied to it, Google Ads. But this is a thing that we can start to use for segmenting all the people on our website. So that's an important data model. But I suppose the flip side of this coin is it's a new data model. And so you've got to think of your approach for how you're going to take those other properties, those other functions, like your integrations to other commerce systems, and how are you going to tie them into that event model? And for that, I'm going to throw it over to Jason.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. So yeah, there are a lot of merchants out there that have used UA for years and years, and even probably classic analytics. And from that time, they've probably incorporated a lot of complicated customizations to that. Because we're starting clean on a new slate here at GA4, we are recommending for a lot of merchants to kind of go in and understand, what events, are you going to need to measure your business, right? We're going to speak a little bit in the next slide about the native integrations that come with a few of the platforms, but those are only a few. So again, we recommend to look into that. As an example, look into your GTM container. How many complicated scripts do you have in there? Are you going to want to have us support mirroring those scripts in another container? Are you going to have to use a connector to do that? And also, what platform do you use? I would imagine, I would hope, at least at this point, a few weeks leading up to UA being stopped propagating, all platforms out there have some type of integration. If it's e-commerce related, you might just want to look to see what purchase events come with that integration, but I would imagine there's something out there for all platforms. So take a look and see what that is for yours. We can probably hop into the next slide here.
Yeah, no, that's, yeah, definitely. We want to take a look at the next slide. And I mean, it's the nice thing is that the platforms that we work with, BigCommerce, Shopify, Miva, all have some form of integration with GA4 that have come out. But Jason, I think you were going to talk a little bit about the different levels of integration, the types of events that it's capturing, and any kind of nuances that might be someone should be aware of, right?
So a lot of our merchants that are on this call, they know who we work with. So these are the players that we work with, right? In e-commerce, BigCommerce, Shopify, and Miva. They all have their own form of a native integration that comes with their own standard purchase events. BigCommerce and Shopify both respectively have 7 each, and they're roughly the same. Miva has a bit more, but basically what they're offering with these native integrations is what I call the foundational parameters that you need in order to measure an e-commerce store, right? Now, there's a million things you can do from there, but these are the standard ones you're going to want to at least get acclimated or at least give you some time to understand what more do you need in order to measure the performance of your specific store. Because as we know, we can get very detailed here, but it's a case by case. It's based off what you sell, how you measure it, and so forth. So again, if I would imagine most know this by now, but if you don't, these 3 do have native integrations with GA4, and these are some of the purchase events that come with them.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. Would you say that this is enough purchase events, or would you, in your expert opinion, be adding more, right?
Perfect segue to the next slide.
It's like we call this or something, right? It's like,
So this is what I consider, and this is probably roughly what Google considers to like stock standard, very basic, what you need to get going with measurements with e-commerce. Now, again, like I said previously, you can do a million things, and I can recommend a million things. The only thing is I can't recommend it until I understand the nature of your business and what you're selling and your audiences and so forth. So these are the standard ones that will help, and they're pretty obvious for anyone that's looking. Obviously, add to cart, purchase, refund, which is actually a big one. These are pretty stock standard. Generate lead, that's probably more of an acquisition, but it's still very important in e-commerce, in my opinion. But I want to give some people, you guys, an example of what you should do once you have these standard purchase events. As an example, add to wish list. That's a good event to look at to see who's adding products to a wish list. But let's take an apparel company as an example. What if you want to do a little bit more based on the nature of your business? You want to, instead of just seeing users adding to wish lists, you want to see users scrolling 70% below a PDP page, but then scrolling back up and clicking on a size chart to see what the measurements are, and then adding that item to a wish list. That is the type of granular data that you can get in GA4 now, and how you can further take these standard events and take it as far as you need. So this will give you the time to start spinning the wheels and figuring out, okay, how can I take this and what would be beneficial for my business?
No, that's awesome. These are all obviously the standards, but Jason, we see merchants coming up with all different types of crazy events. Like, how much flexibility does one have inside of GA4 around that?
Literally anything, and depending on how complex you want to get. But according to Google,
according to
the Google gods, the complexity is, it's a case by case. You can, from the nature of the data modeling, you can get as detailed as you honestly want. And that's one of the points of GA4. So
so if you capture all this data, how easy is it to actually like analyze it and do something with it?
That's another component to it. It's one thing thinking of what you want to measure and then implementing that, but then understanding the data and being able to read it and to make actionable insights from there, right? And there's people like Arctic Leaf that support with that strategy. There's people like Glenn that support with that strategy, and perhaps merchants have internal resources to do that. But this is only part of the story. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of merchants kind of be like, yeah, we can do this, but then what do we do with that information?
Well, that comes up in our business all the time, right? It's like, are we capturing the data? Are we capturing the data? 6 months goes down and it's like, yeah, we've been capturing the data, but what do you want to do with it? Right. Like that's like the important part. Again, you can have all the data in the world, but if you don't know what to do with it, and you don't know how it's going to actually impact or leveraging that data to make decisions on your business, it's irrelevant. So I think it's again, I think it's really important that we kind of be breaking this down as like step by step. Like, okay, this is what you can do with GA4, but you can do a whole lot more. But I think we need to now probably at some point down the road talk about how we actually leverage this data and what we do with it. So these are really all great things, e-commerce related. But now I want to actually ask Glenn. So great, we have e-commerce, right? You've attracted people to your site, right? You want to capture the data of how they've interacted with your brand. Now
Sure.
I want to talk to the master on what events we need to capture for lead generation. How do you bring that customer to your website, right? And how
All right,
do
Josh,
you that data?
I'll do my best. I have to say though that Jason, he gave you the principle, and I hope everybody was catching it, that there are these simple events, but you can string them together and come up with these great combinations that make sense for your business. Events in e-commerce, events in B2B, they're the same. But the way that you're going to use them and what you're going to be actually tracking for may differ. And commonly, we would think that we would turn these events into conversions. So just to finish on that point, yeah, you can have all these events. Like Josh said, you can even put them into a thing like Google BigQuery, where you can look at them over time and analyze them and see. But you do have about 2 to 3 dozen that only should be assigned to be conversions. So let's make sure that we track all the events, but we actually want to think about what we're really moving ahead our business with if we're making them a conversion. So the conversions that we have in B2B, I've listed a number of them here, and I've got some really good news for people who want to track things beyond just a form, but things that definitely include signs of activity, signs of watching a video, signs of searching on your website. A lot of these come out of the box through something that Google came up with called enhanced measurement. And it must be turned on, but from the day that it's turned on inside of GA4, and I'm showing the screen here, it's just one little toggle, you get access to most of these, all but the last bullet point you could get right from just simply toggling that. So I'd encourage you to take a minute and go into your admin settings and see that you have that turned on.
So Glenn, I have a weird question.
Yeah.
Why would someone not turn on enhanced measurements?
Okay, so there's been some exchanges around this, and the best rationale that folks like yourselves and I and others have come up with is that for privacy reasons, and depending on which jurisdiction you're in, Google doesn't want to automatically turn this on. So if you are based in Europe, if you have strong internal privacy regulations that would prevent you from doing the tracking of these events on a website for your customers, then yes, you should check that before you turn that toggle on.
But I'm assuming that you're still giving someone the notification that you're cooking them, and they can
in tandem with that. Sure, yeah. It's fine.
Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Something to just make note of that it could affect your privacy policies, and you should definitely check with your legal counsel and your jurisdictions. And again, we're not lawyers, right? So big disclaimer.
Yeah, and so there are a lot of things you can do when you even exhaust what Google Analytics 4 has. You can, with the help of a friendly, digital marketer or someone who knows analytics, jump into their Google Tag Manager product and take care of any of the other events or combinations of events that you want to turn into conversions.
Got it. Very cool. So now that we've talked about data capture, right, and we've talked about the different types of events, the different types of information that you may want to take in, Now we also kind of touched on how do we read that data. So I know that you guys have put together some kind of pros and cons about the different reporting options and availabilities across Universal Analytics and GA4. So I'll start with Jason, and maybe he can kind of get into a little bit of the weeds on, some of the pros and cons and some of the focus points that, are important. You see what I did there, by the way?
You added it. Thank you. It's catching on. It's going to be a thing.
It is. There you go.
So I think with the reporting, so UA came with, I think, roughly 30 out-of-the-box reports. I think it's something along those lines, default. So anything that you saw on the menu, those were the reports. And they were good, maybe just okay. Most merchants only went as far as that, right? And they didn't go any further than those reports. In GA4, there's really, I don't know, there's only a handful. And the idea is that you can make all your custom reporting. So there is a bit of a learning curve to that. But the learning curve is important because it is your business and it's not terribly difficult to make these reports. And it's only going to give you much better data. But I think that's the most obvious first one that people see when they log into GA4. They're like, there's nothing here. Well, that's because UA had so many reports. That to me is the biggest con. I think I can hand it back to Glenn to see if he can chime in on that one.
They have made some of the reports switched off by default. Reasons I can't understand. A really simple one would be Search Console. So in UA, you went into Search Console, you made a link to Universal Analytics, you go into Universal Analytics, poof, you've got reports. You have one extra step that you need to take in GA4, even after you've linked it. You've got to go into this thing called Customize, and then you get this list that shows what cards would you like to add as your reports. And you tick the boxes for things like Search Console, hit save, there are your reports. So they've got more reports than meets the eye. But I'm going to highlight a slightly different headache, and we're heading into it because if you're listening to this in middle of 2023, then we're about to clock over from June to July. We're about to clock over from second quarter to third quarter, calendar quarter. And of course, between now and when this whole saga is finished, we'll be doing a calendar year over calendar year. And I need to impart the bad news that these reports aren't going to all automatically be in one place. And even if you do get them together, they're not necessarily going to match so that you can get a clear time series of what was happening. You're moving across two different platforms. And so we can try to blunt the blow of that. We can try to make sure that we only look at the metrics that should be the same across. We need to try to make sure that they're looking at an aggregate. Please don't try to do this for those people who are in, Poughkeepsie, who are on a certain kind of computer. No, look at this as your entire database. And then the other item is you want to note that Google Analytics 4 may sometimes bring in sampling, and they'll tell you when they do, but that's there to protect their servers from huge requests on your part. And so you need to download this data, make sure that you check those things. But once you do, you ought to be able to, in something as simple as Google Sheets, get this to report something that you can show to your management team and board that lets them see how the website is doing over time, even though we're stepping from one system to another.
Yeah, no, that's some good advice. That's for sure. It's I think what you kind of touched on something that, as someone as Arctic Leaf, we deal with this on a regular basis, is migrating data. Migrating is not easy. If someone tells you it's easy, it's not. Like, no. They don't necessarily play well together, right? Even something as with Google, that is a self environment, you're going to have mismatch of data. So you can imagine if you're migrating from one e-commerce platform that has a schema of A and you're moving to a alternative platform and it has a data schema of B, that it's not going to just match very nicely and it's going to work really well, right? So, and just so everyone who is kind of aware of this and is watching this and listening and following, data is king, but data is also a pain in the butt, right? And like, to make sure that data is consistent and cohesive, I'm trying very politely not to curse because I've been told I'm not allowed to on this series. So PG, we want to make it family friendly. And so it's just something like a words of warning is just remember that like, it's not all just going to work out of the box. And it kind of brings me to the next slide. And it's kind of like the same thing I tell most of our clients when you go live, expect the worst, right? And I'm going to say this again. When we cut over from GA Universal Analytics to GA4, your data is going to be a mess. Things are going to break. As good as Google is, they're not perfect, right? So just as someone who is not super patient, try to be patient and recognize that this is a pretty significant change to how Google is doing analytics, and the largest one they've done in, I think, what, like 20 years, somewhere around that, right? So expect bugs, expect there to be issues. So Jason, maybe you can tell us a couple of potential issues and we might be able to see. And then Glenn, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the bugs that you anticipate us to see.
Sure. I think one thing to note real quick is that GA4, though Google is quote unquote forcing everyone to adopt by a certain point, GA4 is constantly evolving. They are currently working on it as we speak. And I honestly foresee them working on it for quite some time. I don't think it's going to be a set it and forget it. Much like UA, where they just completely added components for so many years, GA4 is very much like that, particularly when we look at privacy concerns and all that stuff that we're coming at. So just, not to be negative, but just kind of expect that we have to be kind of malleable and understand that those are just going to kind of come down the line. But
malleable is a good word. Malleable, flexible, malleable, all good words.
Yeah. So since our last webinar, we've had the luxury to be able to support some of our merchants with adopting GA4, obviously the basics like creating properties and creating events and integrations and all that stuff. And since then we've came across a few issues that some have been rectified, some are just kind of head scratchers. But just kind of to list a few, transaction IDs, as an example, for whatever reason, they're not set when you deploy e-com tracking. We're kind of figuring out why that is the case, why we have to manually add those IDs in, but that's something we kind of came across. Another one that I found really interesting was in the beginning, Google kind of recommended, hey, create the GA4 property, but you can still use UA in tandem with GA4, even if you're not using GA4 for e-commerce, right? You're still heavily leaning on your UA property for e-commerce, but you still have GA4 working in tandem. And that's great. We recommend that as well, because what that was meant to do was to give our merchants and everyone enough time to acclimate to GA4, get used to the interface and tinker around with it while they're still using UA to measure their performance. But what happened was we started getting a lot of feedback from some of our merchants that, hey, our revenue in UA is completely wrong all of a sudden, and we can't figure out the reasons why. Well, after a bunch of trial and error and going back and forth, we eventually spoke to the folks at Google, and Google essentially said, this is a common problem. We know this is a problem. The only real way to rectify this is to disable UA and to fully adopt GA4. Now, I'm not going to lean into conspiracy here, but it's a pretty funny.
You didn't realize that this is a conspiracy show?
If you want to get someone to use a product, make the old product irrelevant and just make them adopt that one. I'm not saying that's the case, but what I'm saying is that was a recommendation from Google. It's almost it's a moot point at this time, because we have a few weeks until UA is irrelevant anyways, at least to the sense of propagating data. But that was a funny one. So and also Google keeps moving things around. Every time I log into Google GA4, something's changed or missing in the admin. Something's moved here, something's moved there. When I look at technical documentation, missing or this is updated. There's pros and cons to that, but it's frustrating. I think that kind of lends itself to what I said previously, which is this is a constantly evolving piece of software, basically. And Google is trying to figure out the best way to go about this, but it's frustrating for us. It's frustrating for our merchants. Essentially, we are all learning at the same time. So those are just a few ones. What's that?
We're a bunch of guinea pigs, Jason.
We are a bunch of guinea pigs.
Yeah. So it's something just like if you're using or leveraging like video software and things like that, like we use at Arctic Leaf, and you're creating help documents internally for your staff, just remember that something you may have recorded a month ago may no longer be valid today. So just something that kind of as this timeline keeps going on, and if you created resources, internal resources on how to do some of this stuff, it'd probably be a good idea to regularly go back and check in and make sure that it is still accurate, right? That's just something, common sense, right? But, just want to make sure that we point that out. Here, Glenn, did you have any bugs or issues?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I'll just, to Jason's point, if we step back more broadly, we've already said clearly that we aren't in Google's back pocket. And, I'm not sure we're completely conspiracy theorists either, but, if we look at it somewhere in the middle and say, let's forget that it was Google doing this. This is a system which is moving from an old to a new. Some of the problems that we're dealing with right now are there by virtue of the fact that we have two systems. So the point that Jason made with the tracking, there's people that are experiencing the same thing when it comes to, for example, reporting conversions back to Google Ads. You can't have Universal and GA4 both reporting conversions, or else Google Ads is getting double the information. So I suppose what I'm saying is hang in there. When we're only on one platform, which will just be in a few weeks, some of these problems will either go away or we'll actually be in a headspace where we can then just look at one system and just get that thing working. I think right now we're still in betwixt and between and trying to make sure that things all agree with each other. And that's probably making it harder than it needs to be. So I'm just encouraging people to hang in there. And when we're all on Google Analytics 4, then we should be able to, with the help of, as Jason said, some Google engineers who are going to then be 100% focused on that product, we're probably going to be able to make our way through this.
Well said. I agree.
I think we will survive the Google Analytics apocalypse. So I think we've built some tough skin over the years. So I think we can do this. So excuse me. So a couple of key takeaways. We're gonna actually have a little glossary put up on our blog after the seminar. So this way it's an easy way to just kind of look back. Events, right? Events are different. They're going to automatically collecting events, enhanced measurements that Glenn talked about. I don't know why you wouldn't want to turn those on. It sounds like if we're really in the world of data and we want to understand our customers and consumers, then I would turn all of those on. And then you have recommended events, and then you have some custom events. So events. We talked a little bit about platforms are building native integrations. So, we talked about BigCommerce, Shopify, and Viva, but another example, a lot of sites are built on something like HubSpot, right? Arctic Leaf's website's built on HubSpot. They did come out with a GA4 integration. So it was actually quite simple to get that set up, which was great. So if you are on something like a Squarespace, or if you're on like a WordPress or Webflow, like I'm sure that there are other alternatives and integrations that are available. And then obviously the last takeaway here is that e-commerce and B2B do need different events to give you the data that is successful, right? So, and they are very different. As you can see, we care about, not that we don't care about lead gen, it's just not a focal point of our business. we care about once a consumer gets on, we want to capture how that consumer is engaging with your brand. And then for someone like Glenn, and what his agency does is he wants to track the data on conversion of how do you get someone to the actual site, right? So two little things that are different. We got a few minutes left here. There were a couple of Q&As, some questions that came in pre-seminar. So we'll see if we can quickly get through those. And then we have a little bit of a giveaway that we normally do. I'll talk about it in a second. But Katie, you want to talk about the first question that came through?
Absolutely. So the question that came for our panelists, how can organizations fill the gap between what Universal Analytics used to offer out of the box and having to go and create custom reports that don't often work or don't work the same way?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I'm just a bystander here, so someone else got to take this one. So,
I could take a crack at this.
Go for it.
As they've been adding more to the platform, and I want to highlight sessions probably as the biggest one, I would suggest that if you're wondering about whether or not they've got a report that could work for you, that you get yourself up to date on what's already in the platform. Even if you looked as recently as the time we did the last of these OnTaps, which was February, you may have not seen what you were looking for then. I'd encourage you to go back in today. Perhaps the large numbers of people that have been asking Google for this have been heard, and they've been adding more and more. As we said already, sometimes these reports aren't right there in front of you. You have to go into the customize area and enable them. But I would encourage you to go and see if you can get the information that is going to be relevant for your business. Exhaust that first, learn what you can about everything that's inside the interface. There's a very good chance that now, or maybe shortly after they've completely created GA4 as the sole platform standing, they'll have what you're looking for.
Thanks, Glenn. So I know we're a little bit at time right now, so we're going to wrap up here. There was a couple more questions, but we will on our blog them answered by Glenn and Jason. And then we do post the video of this call or this OnTap series on our blog as well with a little bit of a recap. But last but not least, we do a little bit of a survey. So we definitely want to hear from you how the content was, the engagement. Is there a topic that you may and then we definitely want you to do that. And if you do that, we will give you guys someone will win an analytics and UX audit review. So Glenn has offered enough and been generous enough to offer up an analytics review, and Jason and the Arctic Leaf team would do a light UX audit to kind of give you an overview and some best practices and things like that. So definitely worth filling out that survey. That is an actual billable service that we do, and we're going to do that complimentary. So we definitely want to hear that, and then we also want to we just want to hear your feedback. Right? We're getting more into a cadence where we're doing this once a month. So we've had a couple before. We've talked about data and UX. We have another one coming up around referral marketing. So we're really trying to get into a good cadence that this is a once a month kind of thing. And we definitely want to hear to understand, is the content valuable? Because that's, at the end of the day, our objective here is to leaders and give everyone here good insight. So definitely fill out that survey. We want to hear from you, and definitely feel free to provide us. Glenn, thank you so much. You are awesome. Seriously, like the amount of information that is trapped in that brain of yours. I wish there was we can give more of it, but I just have to say,
I love jamming with you guys, and I know that we brought value to people who are just grappling with this.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Glenn. Jason, huge thank you. And then obviously Katie, we got to give Katie a shout out because Katie does all the heavy lifting behind this, puts all the comms together, the registration pages. So huge thank you to Katie. Thank you guys so much for joining us on our OnTap series. I think we even have a third one coming out, right? I think we have another one potentially. So the third. So stay tuned for part 3. With that, without further ado, raise your glass, say l'chaim, cheers, salut, whatever for you. So thanks so much for joining in. Have an amazing rest of your day. All the best. Bye, guys.